Okay. We're interviewing William Hand from Columbus, Georgia. The interviewer is Michael McGregor with the Grand Valley State University's Veterans Oral History Project. To begin with, Bill, where and when were you born?
I was born in 1946 in Dallas, Texas, September.
Okay. And did you grow up in Dallas?
No, my dad was in the Marine Corps, and so we bounced around until I was about 10 years old. We ended up in Houston, Texas, and he retired there, but went to North Carolina. We lived in Miami, then got back. The closest he could get to retire in Texas, our home state, was Houston. We never made it back to Dallas. That's where I ended up growing up from then on until I graduated college.
Okay, when he was in Dallas, was he at the Naval Air Station?
In Houston, he ended up in the recruiting station there. He was the sergeant major of the recruiting and reserve command in Houston.
Okay. Okay. So where did you go to high school at then?
Went to high school there in Houston at Spring Branch High School, and then when I graduated from there, I went on to the University of Houston. Almost ended up at Texas A&M, but I couldn't afford it.
Okay.
So I ended up going and staying at home and going to the University of Houston.
Okay, and at this time your father was out of the service?
Yeah, he retired about 4 years before I graduated from high school.
So what did he do when he retired?
He went into insurance, didn't like that. Then he went into selling frozen food and became a frozen food distributor, and then ended up, before he passed away, as the food manager for the St. Joseph Hospital in Houston.
Okay. So you went to University of Houston. What did you major in?
Well, I majored in accounting, believe it or not, even though my whole focus was to go in the Army and get my commission. So the degree was just secondary to getting my commission. I was more oriented towards the military side of it.
Why did you want to go into this service?
I'd grown up in it. It's all I ever wanted to do. I almost ended up in the Marine Corps instead of the Army. I was a distinguished military graduate, so I had the opportunity to change to the Marine Corps. But after I thought about it and started weighing the advantages and disadvantages of each, there was quicker promotion after captain in the Army, and there was more things to variety of assignments in the Army than there would have been in the Marine Corps.
So this would, you were in an ROTC program at the
Right.
University of Houston, and you were the distinguished
I was one of the distinguished
graduates,
military
which
graduates,
means
yeah.
you got a regular commission, right?
Right. I
Rather
took the
than a,
regular Army commission, yes.
rather than a reserve commission.
Right.
Okay, so, and when did you graduate from college?
1969.
Okay, so you graduated from college 1969, you're taking your commission, then what happened?
Then I went straight to Fort Benning to the infantry officer basic course, and then the airborne school, and then after that I spent a whole 5 months in the 82nd Airborne before I got my orders to go to Vietnam.
Okay.
Then went on to Vietnam in 70, just in time to get to Ripcord.
What time in 70?
Got there at the end of June. Didn't actually get out to my unit until about the 5th or 6th of July. That's when I finally got to the second of the 506.
Okay, so when you get out there, did you know much about what was happening at Ripcord?
The gentleman that was the platoon sergeant for the platoon I was going to at B Company, second of the 506, was in the rear. He had been hit in the arm, and he started telling me about the platoon, and he was going to be my platoon sergeant, but they kind of relieved the platoon leader in one of the platoons and took him away from me and made him the platoon leader. So, but he filled me in as much as he could on the platoon, and it was kind of ironic because I was so new and green. You know, he had to help me put my rucksack together. I'd never seen a rucksack yet in my training before we got there, because all of those went to Vietnam. None of that was in the stateside units. And so he helped me get that together, and while we did that, we talked about my soldiers that I was going to have. The platoon was down. It was never really a full strength platoon. The whole time I was there, it was about 50% strength of what we were authorized.
What was the authorized strength?
It was close to 40 of a regular T&E platoon, but the replacements and the casualties and everything, I never had more than 24 men in my platoon. Okay. And it was basically 2 reinforced squads instead of a full strength platoon, but that's what you dealt with. And that's mostly what we dealt with the whole time. We very seldom operated as a company, except when we were on a fire base and doing fire base security. When we went to the field off the fire base, we usually split up into platoons and not work as companies. You couldn't cover as much when you were doing the reconnaissance and trying to locate and fix the enemy. It was better off having the company spread out.
Okay, so you joined the company, and
Yeah.
what was your reception on the field?
Well, they had been hit the night before on Hill 805 there at below Ripcord, and everything was really tight. You know, my troops were really on the ball because they had been hit and they had their stuff together, I thought. And of course, that first night I was in the field, everything that moved out to the front of my position I thought was the enemy coming at me. If I heard any noise, I was trying to maintain my discipline and not be stupid and let off a round or something and get everybody all upset and worried that something was happening. And I made it through that first night. And that first night when we turned right around and went up on top of Ripcord and were there until the Ripcord was evacuated. So,
Okay, so you went, the next day your company went up actually to the fire base, and you
Right.
stayed there the entire time?
Yeah, it was our turn for fire base security, so they rotated companies on the fire base periodically. And for a couple of reasons. One, it gave the unit a chance to refit and everything, and then to recoup from everything from humping in the bush out there, because you needed some time. You know, people got haircuts and stuff. Matter of fact, one of the men in my platoon was the barber, the company barber. He cut everybody's hair all the time when we were on the fire base. And then we would do our patrols and thing from around and keep reinforcing the defenses of the fire base, and occasionally do patrols out from the close end of the fire base. And mainly our mission was to protect the artillery batteries and the battalion headquarters. And
So
operations center.
you were on the fire base, middle of June until it was
July,
back-
no, July,
Okay.
yeah, about the 7th of July, I think it was 6th or 7th of July until the 23rd when we left.
Okay, so,
It was a interesting way to break into Vietnam as a young cherry lieutenant. You learned fast. If you didn't, you would be in trouble and you'd cause people to get hurt. And fortunately, I had some good squad leaders, good young platoon sergeants. They were all young E5s. We very seldom ever saw a sergeant first class platoon sergeant out in the field. They kind of were always in the rear somewhere, wangled jobs when they got there that weren't really. So we didn't get a lot of the experienced guys. We got young, what they used to call shake and bake sergeants that went to the NCO Academy and got made an E5. If you were an honor graduate, you got made a staff sergeant E6, which my old platoon sergeant that I took over from was, and he was a very effective leader, Sergeant Robeson.
he was a shake and bake?
Yeah, he was an honor graduate shake and bake, so he made staff sergeant right out of the school. But he had his stuff together, and that kind of was good because of him. The platoon had their stuff together too when I got there. And having been in contact, it kind of tightens you up really fast. And I was fortunate there because I didn't have a bunch of guys that had never seen contact or enemy action. All of them had at that point, and pretty tough action. So it made my job a lot easier, and I tried to learn as much from them as they did from me.
Do you think you were accepted very quickly?
I think so. From the reception I got when I started coming to these reunions here for the Ripcord reunions, they didn't hesitate to come up to me and say good to see me again and that sort of thing. So I think I was accepted fairly well. And we always operated pretty tight because my goal when I was in Vietnam was never to lose a man to a booby trap.
Okay.
And so we never walked down fresh trails. We made our own trails. We might parallel trails, but my whole goal was to get my mission done, but also to protect my men and not lose people unnecessarily. And I was fairly successful. I only lost 2 men at the time I was platoon leader. And it was
Was that the booby traps, or?
no. The first one was my radio operator, which was kind of sad because he had just gotten back from R&R and saw his newborn daughter, and he was somewhere else on the fire base near the artillery battery when they took a round that killed him, killed the battery XO, Lieutenant Kelsu, who was the only pro football player ever to be killed in action in Vietnam. And then one of his ammo bearers and I had to go retrieve his body, and that was, I think, the 21st of July, so I'd only been there like a little over 2 weeks, and lost him. And it was sad because he had his flak jacket on, and he didn't have it zipped up. And he took one piece of shrapnel directly to the heart.
Oh my goodness.
He had one scratch on his arm, that was the only other mark on his body. And I was upset and cussing him for not having his flak jacket up when I went to retrieve his body. And then my other loss was one of my NCOs, who was a very good young NCO, but he had gone out to train a new shake and bake NCO that had come to the platoon how to set up a mechanical ambush. And he had a series of 3 claymores set up, and he set his tripwire up and got it all set, and he didn't know that the guy he was training to accidentally tripped the tripwire. And when he went to put the det cord into the center claymore, it connected the system and blew him up, which was another one of the needless losses for me, and it just upset me. But it's one of those things you have to live with. You know, you can't keep tearing yourself apart about it. But you know, the first thing I did when I went to the wall was to look up their names and find them on the wall.
Yeah.
Along with a couple of officers that I knew and had trained with that I knew were killed over there. So it's something you learn to live with. It's tough, but you know, like I said, my goal is to try and get them home safe and get our mission done, but not do something stupid that got somebody killed. And that's all I focused on. That's what I prayed every night when I was in the field.
Just keep looking at the time. Okay, so you went on to Ripcord, and you were there through the evacuation.
Yeah, and then, you know, they had a policy, you know, and then after that, every time when we were out in the bush looking and searching for the enemy, every time we thought we were on to something, they'd move us out. It was like they didn't want us to get into contact again and go through what we did at Ripcord with the major losses that we incurred, and if we got something hot, it seemed like they'd pull us out and put another unit in.
Another unit from the 101st,
yeah,
or just a
yeah,
different
another
unit?
battalion, and kind of frustrating at times. But we still were able to find some things, some bunker complexes and things like that. But after Ripcord, we never did really receive any more heavy contact the rest of the time I was a platoon leader. And then as I became the senior platoon leader in the battalion very quickly, and the policy was, you know, to rotate you out after 6 months, or sooner if something else opened up, you know, to do that. So after about 5 months, I moved to take over the mortars, and I made a big mistake at one point because the mortars were in the rear, because we were on a fire base close to Camp Evans, and so they didn't need the mortars on the fire base. And for a while we had our own hill, and I had like my own little mini fire base, and I was the king of the hill and had part of my sections as security and then one firing section. And then they pulled us off of that. While we were back at Evans, each battalion had a sector of the brigade base camp bunker line that they were responsible for. And at the nightly briefings at the operations center, they were talking about how much trouble they were having out on the bunker line. And the policy was to send an officer that was short out there each night, like a duty officer type situation, and oversee the thing, and then he'd be done after one night. And I said, well, you need to put somebody out there that is going to be there all the time and take charge of the place and do it properly. And he said, you want the job, the battalion XO? I said, oh no, I like the mortars, but you know, that's, to me, that would cure the problem. Well, I didn't have much choice. About a week later, he said, well, Lieutenant, guess what? You're now the OIC of the bunker line. So I went out there, and I had an E7 that was the daytime guy, because I was there from like 4 o'clock until 7 o'clock in the morning, and during the night mostly. And then he would do all the work on the bunker line, reinforcing it, building up the defenses, and checking things in the daytime. So when I went to the battalion XO and said, well, what I would like to do is to set up a policy to make this kind of a honor to get out here on the bunker line and put people that are short in the companies, the guys that have little time left, and get them out of the field. And then if they mess up on the bunker line, they go back to their company. So it was kind of an incentive to do what you're supposed to do, stay alert, fix your position, and do what you were supposed to do. And from then on, we didn't have any more problems. And it worked out well.
Was there any, did you experience any probing or any kind of
Yeah,
activity?
we
on
did.
the,
We did have some, not too much in our sector because we checked it pretty carefully, but we'd get a briefing from the Brigade Operations Center each afternoon before I went out on the line. And there had been some cases where we had, charges set out with flue gas and had C4 behind it, as the expector to make it blow into the wire when somebody came in. And you'd find some places where the guys, sappers had come in, taken the C4 and put it on the opposite side, so if you blew it, it came right back in your face. But the actual probing of any contact, some mortars once in a while. Of course, they had the mountain range that was out to the west of Camp Evans. They called it Rocket Ridge because every once in a while we'd start taking 122 millimeter rockets from the Rocket Ridge. Would come into Evans, but we never hit too many on our side. We were on the east side of the brigade. We'd have, my biggest problem was keeping drug dealers from selling stuff to the troops.
Okay. Go into that a little bit. A lot of people think about Vietnam as widespread drug use and this and that. And obviously, as a platoon leader, did you have any problems with drug use when you're out in the field?
Not at all. When they went to the field, they policed themselves almost. I didn't have to do a lot. They would take care of it. They was putting their lives in danger, their fellow soldiers, and they would take care of anybody that tried to do something like that. I do not recall ever smelling any pot or any drug use in my platoon the whole time I was there because they kind of were policing themselves. But I heard of it in other units, but we seemed pretty straight about that. When we were on stand down in the rear, half of them would stay drunk, and some of them would do pot in the rear of the brigade when they were on stand down. But I never caught any, but I'd heard of it in the battalion and other places. But most of the time, it was funny because I had a medic that told me, he says, "Don't ever let them take me and put me in the rear permanently." And I said, "What do you mean? When you get short?" He said, "No, the LT," he says, "if they put me in the rear, I'll stay drunk 24 hours a day." And he was. In the rear, he was an alcoholic. But for some reason, when he got back out into the field, he didn't have any withdrawal or anything. He would stay straight in the field. He was a good medic. But you get him back on stand down, and if you wanted to find him, he was drunk half the time. And of course, they drank a lot at night when they were standing down, letting off the pressure. And it's okay there, to let off the pressure, but not when they hit the field, and they knew it, and they were good about it. And I never had any problems with that.
So then you had problems with drug dealers when you were responsible for the section of the perimeter?
We actually caught guys coming up to the wire and selling it to soldiers. Vietnamese
coming up to the wire? Okay.
And I caught one time. I suspected him, and in the beginning I had a lot of guys that were put on the bunker line that were potheads and that were back because they were pending court martial and things like that. And that's why that's not good to have for security on the bunker line. But someone had told me about one of the guys on the bunker line was selling. So he had gone on an appointment, and I checked his position, and I found an ammo can underneath the culvert section sleeping position under the plywood. And I pulled it out and opened it up, and there was like 2,200 marijuana cigarettes, 26 vials of heroin, and a 2-inch tall bottle of pure opium. And I knew it wasn't the kid that was there the night before. It was the guy that had gone to get his medical appointment done, and I thought was the pothead and the distributor. And I took it to the MP station, and I told them what had happened and how I'd found it. And they said, "Oh, let me see it." And I didn't tell them how much it was at that point. They opened up the ammo can, and I thought that sergeant was going to drop his jaw when he saw how much was in there. And I said, I know who did it, and I know it wasn't the guy that was on there, but I can't prove it. So they got him later, but I couldn't do anything that time. And that was the only time I really encountered anything in my sector But I'd heard of it in other sectors. We had villages that were not that far from Camp Evans, and they would just come up in the daytime in broad daylight and sell stuff to guys. And we actually took some orders one time from I had my own mortar section there on my sector of the bunker line for immediate reaction stuff. And I had one engagement one time with some mortars from outside of Evans that was in the lowlands and not up where we normally had contact. It was some Viet Cong. But most of the time what we saw, and when we were in the bush there in I-Corps, was NVA. We never saw much Viet Cong except back in the brigade area and the associated area around that.
So did you spend the back half of your tour just on that kind of duty?
Yeah, about my last 5 months was there.
Did you have any other duties that you had to perform?
No, they basically said, that's it. You know, you're going to be doing that most of the time. You're every day. I mean, it was an everyday thing. It wasn't any days off or anything like that. But every day I'd come in. I had my own little hooch area that I could get some sleep during the day away from everything. And then I'd head over and get my briefing at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, go out there and stay on the bunker line until 7 in the morning or daylight, and then I'd head back in and turn over to my E7 and get some sleep and come back out again.
Same thing the next day.
Every day. Except for R&R, that was kind of fun. I went to Hong Kong.
You went to Hong Kong, yeah?
And then when they started getting down and drawing down in 71, the R&R flights weren't full, so you could take 7-day leaves.
Okay.
So I took a 7-day leave, went to Taipei also at the end of my tour, and so it was kind of neat. But that was it basically for Vietnam. Then I ended up coming back to Fort Benning.
Okay, well, when you went over to Vietnam, were you still a second lieutenant or
First lieutenant.
First
I had
lieutenant
gone,
at that time. Okay.
after I got out of the 82nd, I came down to Benning to go to Ranger School en route
Okay.
and got hurt. And they said, well, you can go on to Vietnam, or you can and take your normal leave you have to go over there, your PCS leave, or you can stay here and lose all but 10 days of your leave and recycle into the next Ranger School. And I said, well, what about can I go to jungle school? So they ended up letting me go to jungle school, and I didn't lose any of my leave en route there.
So you went to jungle school in Panama?
Yeah. It was good.
How long was that?
It was,
how long was
it was
jungle
only
school?
2 weeks then. You know,
And what did they consist of? What
well,
training did
they taught you how to survive in the jungle, how to operate, do land navigation, everything from setting up, defensive positions, how to set up a sleeping position or anything of that nature when you were in the low country. Of course, none of it really ever applied to me in the mountains in I-Corps, because we didn't get into the steamy lowland type swampy areas and things like that up there. It was all mountains, and again, that was some area that could be pretty nice if it wasn't during the wartime.
It was more like a forest than a jungle.
Yeah, exactly. And but pretty thick at times.
Yeah.
When you couldn't even see up through the trees sometimes. It was so thick. And trying to get resupplies in and things like that. I remember one time it was kind of funny. We couldn't get an LZ cut to get our resupplies in, and we had a soda fund in the platoon in the company, and the first sergeant in the rear would always send us out these long plastic tubes and of onions and things that he would acquire for us. It was extra that we could use in making our sea rations. And it was kind of inventive to try and see what you could do with making the sea ration meal something different than just a can. And we had to kick out the sodas and stuff, and we had one case of Fanta root beer, I'll never forget. It caught a tree limb, and everything exploded in the case of soda. And then some guys that wanted it so bad were standing under the tree with their mouths open, drinking the root beers coming down from the trees. But that was kind of your thing. You'd take the soda, and you would want to keep it for a special occasion, during when you were in the field. Each one of us got about 3 or 4 sodas from the soda fund. And over a period, we'd get resupplied every 3 or 4 days. So you had to kind of figure out what time of day or what meal you wanted to drink your soda at. Of course, they were all hot, but you didn't care. It still tasted good.
So you were buying them, though?
Yeah. Everybody, when we had paydays, they'd send it, sergeant take so much out of their pay to go into the soda fund and everything else that we did for the company funds.
Did was there any other Class 6 allowance for you guys? or-
No, only, we didn't have, like some of the units I heard had beer and stuff when they were on fire bases. That didn't happen with us. The only time you could get alcohol or anything like that was when you were in the rear in the brigade area. Then you could go to the Class 6. They had them in, they had, I forget the name of the soda now, but it was one soda they couldn't even get rid of. It was so bad. And I can't remember the name of which one it was, but it was like a Sprite type thing, but it was something different. But anyway, they couldn't give it away at the PX. They had a little PX inside some concertina wire that you could get candy and junk like that, and cameras and film and the little nice necessities that you like to have.
Yeah.
But you couldn't get rid of this other one. So I wish I could remember the name of it, because they were just giving it away. They were taking room up in their area.
Was that Bubble Up or Bubble 7 or something?
No,
It was like a Sprite. I think it was like a
Yeah.
7-Up Sprite.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I can't remember the name of it now, but it tasted bad. I wouldn't drink it either. But and when we were on stand down, all the guys would go over and do that and get letter writing stuff, and that was all they had in that little PX. It was like a trailer,
Yeah.
and a single wide trailer, and all the sodas were out on pallets outside the trailer and inside the little containment area there for it. But and then of course when you get to stand down, it's I know when I came in after Ripcord, right before we had a memorial for all the guys that we had killed, that's really the first time I had time to stop and think about how close I had come to buying the farm, And we didn't have all the nice things they have now, where you can Skype and do all that kind of things that they got now. And I'm glad they do for them. The only communication we had going back home was letters, or I'd send cassettes back. And then we got what we had called Mars calls. And you could go to this shortwave radio station there on the brigade base camp area and call back to the States, and they would link up with a guy in Washington State. And then he would make the phone call from his house to whoever you wanted to call. In my case, it was my parents, because I wasn't married at that time. And you'd have to sit there and say over every time you were through talking, so you know when to release the mic, and they could talk back. And they had to teach them how to say over when they were through talking. And I had two of those. Once at Christmas, when I happened to be that's in the rear, and then right before I came home to let them know when I was coming home.
Did they have a Mars station at Evans then?
Yes, they did.
It was at Evans.
It was
okay.
at Evans. And of course, the other thing you did, the aviators, they had the forward air controllers had a little strip there at Camp Evans, and then they had their little living area, and it was always neat to go where that was air conditioned. It was Air Force. They had all kinds of good stuff. And you try and go over and see them when you're in the rear too, and have a cold beer and sit there and watch a movie or something with them in their air conditioning quarters.
Yeah. Good refrigeration and everything else.
They had all that good stuff. The Air Force always did everywhere you went. But
So you did your tour, and when did you get home?
I came home in June of '71.
Did you experience any hostile feelings or anything when you got back?
The biggest thing that bugged me was the way they treated soldiers when they came home. It's not like now where all the affection and the thanks are so well expressed and welcomed home. And part of it may be the fact that we went over there as individual replacements, not as units, like they did with the current wars. And when we came home, there wasn't any parades, there wasn't any thank you. Half the time they stared at you if you were in uniform and made nasty comments like baby killer and things like that. The worst one I experienced was in seeing, wounded guys come home and how much nobody cared about them. A few of the people, the old vets from World War II in Korea, would make good comments to them and things like that, but the normal everyday person were not thankful for what they'd done or what they'd gone through for their country, unlike today and what we go through. And that's probably the thing that burns me the most. I'm glad they do it for them, but I'm still a little bit ticked off that nobody ever did it. I think it was about 3 years ago at Fort Benning, that's where I retired, in Columbus. Fort Benning had a Welcome Home Vietnam celebration, in which they invited all the Vietnam vets in the area to come out, and they actually had a welcome home ceremony, and for all of us. And that's the first time
That's nice.
that ever anything had been done for the Vietnam guys.
That's great.
And you know, we're dying out. And that's the
Amen.
thing.
We're the old generation now.
I saw something somewhere. A friend of mine sent me an email and said there's only like 30% of the Vietnam vets still alive.
Really?
Yeah. And I didn't think it was that low, but he said it did.
No, I wouldn't either, because just looking at myself, I turned 25 in Vietnam. I got
Yeah.
drafted. I was just about 23.
Yeah.
And I got drafted and that way, and I was old. This was in '66, and
Yeah, I was 24 when I got there.
A
So.
lot of guys, went in at 18 and 69 or 70,
Yeah.
but time flies. While you're overseas in Vietnam, one thing we people hear about, the stereotypes is bad race relations. And could you address that a twofold way, in the field and in the rear?
In the field, not a problem. Yeah. In the rear, there was problems. Again, I didn't see as much with my guys as I saw in other units in and around. We had incidents of attempted fragging, things like that in the brigade base camp area, when guys would get hold of a weapon or something and go after a leader that they didn't like or they felt treated them wrong. But you did see the segregation between the blacks and the whites happen. They just didn't associate as much with each other. There wasn't a lot of interplay between the different races that way, socializing with each other. As you see now, I mean, you don't see the breakout. And it was, of course, they always were doing what they call the DAP and the black power, and then the black wristbands and things like that to indicate black power. But that only really came up to become an issue when we were in the rear. In the field, everybody was tight, and if they weren't, the people in the platoon would take care of whether they were black or white. And you had the same, it wasn't just the blacks going, it was whites towards the blacks as well in some cases. But it occurred. I think it occurred more when we were out of the field, and they had to stop and think that, right now this guy isn't covering my back, and I can be angry about what's going on. And all of it was prompted by the stuff that was happening in the States, not by what was happening there on the ground. We never had, at least to my knowledge, in my platoon, and I don't know about the company, but I think the company as well, a lot of racial problems, even on stand now, other than the fact that they didn't tend to socialize with each other.
You just have a little some self-segregation.
Yeah, exactly. And don't know why. You're out there and they're friends today, and you just didn't see the interaction that we have now. I think amongst them. After the war and in the units I've had, I wouldn't tolerate it. When I was a company commander or an S3 in a battalion, after I got back, I wouldn't put up with it. And
you didn't put up with what?
With any racial overtones or problems, anything directed towards race. I said, we're one army, we're one unit, and if you can't live with that, then you don't need to be here. Don't bring up your personal feelings in where it's involved in our operations or our unit.
It wasn't very long after you'd gotten back where we obviously got out of Vietnam, but also went to the all-volunteer Army. How was that transition for you?
It was good. I think it created a better Army for the most part, because a lot of guys felt they were, and you'd read about guys during the Vietnam era being, that they weren't treated the same when they got drafted, and they sent the black guys out front and all that. That's not true in our unit. And I didn't see that, and I couldn't understand why it was being written. I think it's just some people blowing some things out of proportion. But the all-volunteer Army was the way to go, because everybody that was there wanted to be there, and you did your job, and what you did out off duty and who you socialized with was fine, but we socialized well together on and off duty most of the time after that. Because when I came back, and was in the infantry school, of course, when we did all our training, I taught platoon tactics, And, you know, I didn't see any of that occurring with the officers, but that's who I was dealing with mostly was lieutenants when I first came back, but wasn't a big problem.
So you're basically an instructor in the basic course,
when I came,
infantry
yeah,
basic
when I
course?
came back from Vietnam, I came to Fort Benning to the infantry school as an instructor in platoon tactics and company operations, and then ended up from there going to Germany for 3 years. And
Now, what kind of assignments did you have in Germany?
in Germany, I had to go. You know, at one point we had a secondary specialty as an officer, and you had to work in that secondary specialty. And so one of mine at that point was non-appropriated fund stuff, so they stuck me in the USER headquarters in Heidelberg. And the only way I got out of there was I asked to be commander of the headquarters company. So I commanded the headquarters company for USER headquarters in 7th Army. So I had like 32 generals in my company, which was interesting because all of their clerks and things like that thought they were prima donnas and could do what they wanted to do and not have duties and things like that, and because they worked for a general or a full colonel. And I said, no, that's not the way it works, and I had a good first sergeant, but I took that job and kept it till right near the end of my tour in Germany.
This time you were a captain?
Yeah, I made captain right before I left Vietnam.
Okay.
And it was quick in those days. I mean, you come in, you were a first lieutenant in 12 months, and 12 months from that date you were a captain. Not true anymore. But, and then it slowed down. I thought it took me forever to make major. And it took about 8 or 9 years before I made major after I made captain. And so it slowed down after Vietnam, and of course the reduction in forces started hitting when I was an instructor at the infantry school. And first it was the reserve guys, you know, they nailed some reserve guys that I thought should have been untouched, and some of the regular Army guys should have gone. But they didn't have a regular Army ref until I think 74. And it had to be by act of Congress. It couldn't just be a directed thing like with the reservists. And then they got some of those guys that shouldn't have been, that should have been gone before some of the reserve officers that I saw get to go back. But at least they had the opportunity when they went back to retain their old rank, and then if they could get reserve time as an officer when they retired as the captain or whatever the reserve rank was. That much was good. But after the Germany tour, I ended up going to Fort Hood and to the 1st of the 5th Cav, and there I was the S3 first, and then I had to do that before he'd let me have a company, because I always wanted a line company, not that. So I got into the mechanized side of the infantry at that point. So I'd been airborne, I'd been air assault in Vietnam, and now it was the mechanized side of it. And so I did that. I was S3 for about 8 months, I think it was, and then got a company, a maneuver company there, and just happened to be another Bravo company, and commanded it. You're only supposed to get command for 12 months because of the need for everybody to get command. Well, my battalion commander had kept me in there. I was on my 14th month. The brigade commander figured out that I'd been in command and said, you gotta replace him. And about that time is when I came out of the majors list. So I ended up going to the Corps G1, 3rd Corps G1 office, and did that for a year before I left there. And then came back to Benning from Fort Hood. And because of my mechanized experience and the experience of having been an instructor there, they made me the deputy chief of the Bradley Fighting Vehicle New Equipment Training Team. So I brought that vehicle into the Army inventory as the training unit. And I did that for, 3 years. And then as we started the institutional courses, the Bradley Commander's course, the Master Gunner's course, the Gunner's course, and all that in the infantry school, they moved me from the new equipment team to start that training up. So I got those started up. And then from there I ended up going to Egypt for a year as with the multinational force and observers in the Sinai.
Peacekeepers in the Sinai?
Yeah. I was the deputy chief of the liaison system, and it was kind of interesting. It was made up of 11 different countries, and I worked for an Australian colonel, and I was his deputy, and I had 3 British clerks, I think 2 British captains, an Australian captain, an American major, a Dutch captain, a French lieutenant colonel, and a Italian Navy commander, all as part of my team, and 1 English major as well. And it was an interesting year, but then when I finished that, I came back to 3rd Army, and I was in the G3 there for 3 years. One of the colonels that I'd worked with at Fort Benning, my second tour, and started with the Bradley, had interviewed with him to be one of the basic course company commanders, the officer basic course company commanders. And unfortunately, the top major assignment there was the new equipment training team for the Bradley. And he said, I hate to say it, they're not going to let me have you. They want you for that. So I ran into him. He was in Force Comp. His name was Colonel John Fuller. And he was about to take command of the 29th Infantry Regiment at Fort Benning. And I would see him every day when we worked out during lunch and did PT. He said, how would you like to come to work for me? And I said, well, no, I don't want to go from one puzzle palace in 3rd Army to a Force Com puzzle palace too. And he said, no, I'm not talking about that. And he told me he was fixing to take command of the regiment. And he said, I had 3 lieutenant colonel positions. And I had made lieutenant colonel at that point. And he said, one's my deputy regimental commander, one's chief of the new equipment training team for the Bradley, and one is my S3. And he said, I want you for at least one of those positions. And he said, I'm not sure which one yet. Well, it took him a year, and the commander of the infantry school was designated to be his chief of infantry, and he could dictate assignments. So he told Branch that I want this guy down here, and I want him down here in 3 weeks. So I got moved out of there early. I only spent 3 years instead of 4 in 3rd Army, and went down there and took over first as the new equipment training team chief, and then I was the regimental XO when right before I retired. And right before I retired, they moved me up as the director of evaluation and standardization in the infantry school. And that was kind of ironic too, because I came into the Army on airborne status in the 82nd, and I ended up, that position was an airborne because we had to do inspections on the airborne units. So I retired in airborne status. So it was kind of funny because when I went back to do my jump refresher, the black hat in the airborne school told me, he said, well, you want to, he was just gloating at the chance to put this lieutenant colonel through the paces again. And I did some parachute landing falls in the sawdust pit, and a couple of things on the swing landing trainer. And he said, well, you want to go up on the 250-foot tower? I said, no, I still remember what it feels like. And he said, well, you want to do any more on the 30-foot tower? I said, nah, I think I remember it all by now. And he said, you're good to go. So I went to jump my first jump, and there was a kid in there. He must have been 18 or 19. And then he was in their 3rd jump. And I said, well, how's it been going? And he said, well, the first jump was great. Second jump was kind of windy, and I did a pretty nasty landing. I said, well, I don't know what you're worried about. I said, the last time you jumped, last time I jumped, you weren't even born. And he kind of, ooh. But it was kind of fun to finish off that way, because that's what I had done earlier. And it turned out pretty good. I can't complain about my 23 years.
Oh, great.
I probably worked maybe for 1 or 2 bosses that I didn't really care for, but that's not bad in 23 years.
No, it sounds like you had a wonderful career. And what year did you retire in?
92.
92.
And it kind of helped me with my first job when I retired, because the Nell Corporation hired me to go train the Saudis on the Bradley.
Okay, so you went to Saudi Arabia?
Yeah, for 3 years.
Oh, wow.
The first 2 years I was there designing the training package. I was in the guise of the quality control manager of training. What I was doing was designing the training package to train their infantry units after they got the Bradleys. Initially, all we did was maintenance training, but then we had the package put together for them to train their brigade that had the Bradleys. They bought 200 of them.
Okay.
And so FMC hired the Nell Corporation to do the training. They hired me. I wasn't even gone on terminal leave yet from retirement before they were calling me. So it worked out pretty good.
That's great.
And the family separation got old. First 2 years I did that. The last year I was the advisor to the commander of the Royal Saudi Land Force Infantry School on integrating Bradley training into their institutional courses for their officers. And as time drug along, I said, this family separation's getting old. I get home about every 4 months, but I was missing so much. My daughters were, I met my wife when I first got back from Vietnam there in Columbus, and they were there, and that's where we'd planned to retire. But they were in high school, and I was missing a lot of things there, and I made it home for all the key things, but that wasn't enough. So finally, about 8 months into my last contract, I said, I'm ready to go home. I'm going to resign my position here. And the prince was a little upset with me at first until I told him it was because of family. And family is real important to the Saudis. So when I told him that was the reason I was going home, was need to help be there for my family, and no qualms then, but he still wasn't real pleased because I've been fortunate enough to get some things done in the school that was working pretty good. Had a really good, better than average, I thought, Saudi colonel that was overseeing their training. Most of the time I was disappointed with the Saudis because their work ethic's not the same. I mean, you get 4 or 5 good hours of training out of them in a day, you were lucky.
Okay.
They'd lose them after prayer and all this. They'd pray 5 times a day, and after they do their morning prayer, they had to have a tea break, and then you might get an hour or so out of them, and then it was time for the noon prayer, and then the afternoon prayer, and the dusk prayer, and then the night prayer. By the time all that was over, and the time they took to get back to training was pretty bad. But in the infantry school, he had pretty good training.
Great. Well, thank you very much for interviewing. I really appreciate it, Bill.
Yeah,
Okay.
enjoy it. Thank you.
And let's get this up, and we're set.